Take your hand off the counter. A damp little pawn shop on Pratt Street, Baltimore, on a rainy February afternoon. A young widow's trembling fingers slid a silver pocket watch across the glass, the last keepsake of her dead mother, the Gaelic words on its lid worn soft beneath her calloused thumb. Behind her, a heavy-set man in an expensive suit leaned in close, his voice low, backing her into a corner. $30. Take it and we'll call your debt square. Maeve Sullivan nodded through her tears, 27 years old, so thin her shoulder blades pressed against her frayed coat, her auburn hair pinned up in a hurry, her eyes carrying the weight of too many sleepless nights. She needed the money for her 4-year-old daughter's asthma medicine, the little girl wheezing back home. Then a voice came from the shadows at the back of the shop, cold and slow, like steel dragged over stone. I said, take your hand off the counter. Crispin Vale stepped into the light, 34, tall, in a long charcoal coat, a thin scar running along his jaw, his gray eyes never blinking. The whole shop went silent, because everyone down at these docks knew exactly who he was. The man in the suit went pale and stepped back. Crispin slid the watch back toward Maeve. Some things aren't for sale, ma'am. But who was this mysterious man? And what dangerous secrets were hidden beneath the bruises on her wrist? If you believe a person's dignity should never be put up for sale, hit like and subscribe to follow their incredible journey. Our story begins 9 hours earlier, on that very same damp February morning. At 4:02 in the morning, the city was still asleep, and the rain had stopped at some point, leaving a damp silence spread over the small rented room perched above an old shoe repair shop on Pratt Street. Maeve Sullivan didn't wake because of an alarm clock, but because of a sound she had known by heart for the past 14 months, the dry, wheezing cough of the little girl curled beside her. She sat up at once, her hand finding her daughter's back in the darkness, rubbing slow, gentle circles the way her mother had once done for her long ago. Nora Beth, who was 4 years old, her soft hair stuck to her forehead with sweat, burrowed into her mother's arms and whispered that her chest hurt. Mommy. Maeve reached for the inhaler set on the wooden crate beside the bed, shook it lightly, and heard the sound that made her heart tighten, almost empty. Only a few doses left. She pressed the inhaler to her child's mouth, coaxed her to breathe in deeply, slowly, and counted every breath until the wheezing softened, and Nora Beth drifted back to sleep in her arms, small and warm and everything Maeve still had left in this world. Maeve sat still for a very long time, not daring to move for fear of waking her, only listening to the breathing that had become steady again and letting worry tighten around her chest in silence. When the weak yellow streetlight spilling through the gap in the curtains was enough for her to see, she gently laid her daughter back on the pillow, pulled the thin blanket up to the little girl's chin, and tiptoed to the cramped kitchen corner. On the crooked table sat a dented tin cookie box, the only bank she had. Maeve opened the lid, poured the coins and a few crumpled bills into her palm, then counted them again and again, as if the number might change if she counted enough times. $11. $11 for the week ahead, for her daughter's medicine, for food, for the rent already overdue, which the landlady still hadn't had the heart to mention. Beside the box was a stack of bills she had arranged neatly in order of urgency, the pitifully tidy order of someone who had grown used to controlling the smallest things because the larger ones had long ago slipped beyond her reach. The hospital bill from Nora Beth's admission the previous winter, the overdue rent notice, the prescription that needed to be refilled within 2 days if she didn't want her child having another attack in the middle of the night with nothing in her hands. Maeve closed her eyes, drew in a deep breath, and told herself she had survived nights worse than this, that she would find a way, that she always found a way. A very soft knock sounded at the door, 3 familiar taps, and Maeve didn't need to ask to know who it was. Mrs. Agnes Kowalski, the 71-year-old Polish landlady who lived downstairs, stood there in an old sweater, her silver hair pinned neatly back, her eyes already poor but still lit with the kind of gentleness Maeve rarely encountered anymore in life. "I heard the little one coughing," she said in a voice touched by a foreign accent, and she brought up a bowl of still warm oatmeal and a small jar of honey already more than half empty. Maeve tried to refuse, tried to say she couldn't accept anything more, but Mrs. Agnes only pushed the bowl into her hands and shook her head, saying that at her age she didn't eat much anyway, and it was better saved for the little girl. The 2 women stood at the threshold in the dim light, saying very little, because among people accustomed to going without, kindness was often quiet and needed no elaborate thanks. After Mrs. Agnes had gone back down the stairs, Maeve closed the door and carried the bowl of oatmeal to the bedside, setting it there for when her daughter woke, then stepped toward the small mirror hanging on the wall, with a long crack running through it to get ready for the first shift of the day. The woman in the mirror looked back at her with a pale face and eyes shadowed by nights without full sleep, her thin shoulders jutting beneath her shirt. Maeve rolled up her sleeve to wash her face, and in that brief moment, the light fell straight onto her wrist, where dark purple bruises still marked her skin in the shape of a hand and hadn't yet had time to fade. She stood frozen for 1 second, then quickly pulled her sleeve down over the back of her hand, hiding it carefully as if not seeing it meant it didn't exist. As if she concealed it well enough, the whole world would never know the truth she had carried in silence for 14 months. She didn't know that in only a few hours, someone would see what she had tried so hard to hide. At 4:45, Maeve was already standing in front of the old office building 4 blocks from her rented room, where she worked a cleaning shift before business hours, the first of the 3 patched-together jobs that kept mother and daughter alive. She mopped hallways, emptied trash, wiped down glass panes that someone else would dirty again by evening, doing it all in silence with hands so calloused they could no longer feel the cold of the water. When the sun came up, she hurried across to Dietrich's Corner Diner on the other side of the street in time for her waitressing shift, and that was where every burden she carried took on a specific face, the face of Roland Dietrich. The 48-year-old owner, fat and heavy, always dressed in expensive suits that didn't fit the shabby diner he ran, stood behind the cash register and looked at her with the eyes of a man who knew perfectly well that the person before him had no choice except to endure. Maeve lowered her head in greeting, tied on her apron, and began carrying plates for hours without rest, smiling at every customer, though her legs were aching and her stomach had been empty since the night before. Near noon, when she went to the counter to receive her pay for 2 days, Roland opened the drawer, counted out a stack of bills, then pulled back nearly half of it, growling that last week she had broken a stack of glasses, and it had to be deducted. Maeve knew perfectly well she hadn't broken a single glass, knew it was a lie he had used again and again as an excuse to drain the wages earned by her sweat, but she only clenched her fist beneath her apron and swallowed the tightness in her throat, because arguing meant losing the job, and losing the job meant her child would have no medicine. Roland looked at her and shrugged, adding that if she didn't like it, she was free to go find somewhere else, that there were a dozen girls out there ready to take her place. She took the small amount of money left, folded it neatly into the inside pocket of her coat, and turned away without letting him see that her eyes had gone red. At the end of her shift, while clearing the tables with leftovers on them, Maeve gathered a plate of food that was almost untouched, a sandwich and a few slices of French fries still warm, and instead of throwing it into the trash as the diner rules required, she secretly wrapped it in a paper napkin. Outside the back door, beneath the awning that kept off the rain, an older homeless man sat there every day, thin and frail in a torn coat, and Maeve placed the food into his hands along with a cup of hot water, quietly saying that it was cold today and he should eat so his stomach would be warm. The man looked up at her with tearful eyes and stammered his thanks, and Maeve only smiled and shook her head, because she understood very well what hunger was, understood the feeling of standing in the middle of the world with no one reaching out a hand, and she told herself that as long as she could still share even a piece of bread, she would do it, exactly as her mother had taught her. That kindness wasn't something only the rich had the right to own. But just as she turned back inside, the old phone in her pocket vibrated, and when she saw an unfamiliar number on the screen, Maeve's whole body went rigid. She knew who it was. She answered, lifted the phone to her ear, and on the other end came a cold male voice, claiming to be from a debt collection company, reminding her for the who knew how many times that her husband's debt was still there, that her time was running out, that they knew where she lived, and knew about her daughter too. Maeve pressed her back against the cold wall, her trembling hand covering the receiver, whispering that she was doing everything she could, that she needed more time, but the man on the other end only gave a mocking laugh and hung up, leaving her standing there with her heart pounding and the bruises on her wrist like reminders of the price of delay. She hadn't yet had time to gather herself when Roland was suddenly standing behind her, having overheard part of the call, and on his lips was a smile that sent cold down her spine. He said he knew a place that could help her get some cash right away, a pawn shop he knew on Pratt Street, and that she should go with him now, because a woman buried under debt like her shouldn't be picky. Maeve wanted to refuse, wanted to run, but he had already placed a hand on her shoulder and pushed her toward the door, and she thought of her daughter's almost empty inhaler, thought of the 2 short days she had left, then lifted her hand to her chest where she hid her mother's silver watch, the last thing she could trade for her child's breath. At noon that same day, not far from Pratt Street, in another corner of Baltimore, where cargo ships lay motionless along the gray waterfront, Crispin Vale stood beside the glass window overlooking the harbor and drained his first cup of black coffee of the day. People said many things about him around these docks, that he held most of what happened along the waterline in his hands, that one nod from him could open or close anyone's door. But what few people understood was that Crispin Vale ruled his world not through fear, but through a set of rules so hard they were almost chilling. And the first of those rules was never to touch the sweat-earned money of those weaker than himself. That morning, one of his own men had just broken that rule. In the office that was plain to the point of austerity. No gold, no display, only an old wooden desk and a few chairs. Crispin sat in silence while a young man named Bishop stood before him, stammering through an explanation. Tobias Vale, his 60-year-old uncle, stood quietly beside him with graying hair and the weathered face of a man who had walked through too much loss, then placed a notebook and a stack of money on the desk. This money, Tobias said in a low, even voice, was the extra share Bishop had collected from old Murphy's family at Pier 8, dock workers who had bent their backs their whole lives and still never had enough to eat. Crispin didn't look up at once. He only opened the notebook slowly, ran his eyes over the numbers, then set it down, and finally looked straight into the eyes of the sweating subordinate before him. He asked, in a voice low and slow like steel dragging over stone, whether Bishop knew how old Murphy was this year, whether he knew the old man's wife was bedridden, whether he knew how many meals that family had skipped to gather the money Bishop had just put in his pocket. Bishop lowered his head and couldn't answer. Crispin stood, came around the desk, and for a moment the whole room seemed to hold its breath. But he didn't raise a hand, didn't shout. He only stepped close and said quietly that there were lines which, once crossed, offered no way back, that a man who took bread from the mouths of the poor didn't deserve to stand under his roof for even one more day. He ordered the entire sum returned to the Murphy family that very morning, with double compensation taken from Bishop's own share, then told him to gather his things and disappear from the docks before nightfall. Bishop opened his mouth as if to beg, but when he looked into Crispin's unblinking gray eyes, he understood that every word would be useless, so he only nodded, took the reduced portion left to him, and quietly walked out. When the door closed, the room sank into silence, and Tobias poured his nephew another cup of coffee, saying softly that the way he handled things was becoming more and more like his father's way in the old days. Crispin didn't answer. He turned back to the harbor, where the morning mist still spread faintly over the water. Tobias stood beside him for a long while. Then, in a gentler, more cautious voice, he mentioned that the anniversary of the death was only a few days away, that he had ordered flowers as he did every year, and asked whether Crispin wanted to go to the cemetery with him this year. Crispin's hand tightened slightly around the coffee cup, and for a moment, the cold, powerful face that made the entire harbor cautious around him showed something very different, a thin crack revealing grief that had been buried for many years. He didn't answer his uncle's question, only said quietly that every time that day came, he wondered what might have happened if he had done things differently, if only he had arrived sooner. Tobias placed a hand on his nephew's shoulder and said nothing more, because there are kinds of pain that words only make heavier. And the 2 men stood there by the window looking out at the water, 2 silent figures in the cold February morning. After a while, Crispin set down his coffee cup, draped his charcoal overcoat across his shoulders, and told Tobias he would drive himself around to check a few places in the neighborhood, including the pawn shop on Pratt Street, where the books had shown a few numbers these past days that didn't sit right with him. He had no idea that at that very moment, only a few blocks away, a woman was being pushed toward that very pawn shop, carrying a silver watch against her chest, and a wound almost exactly like the one he had failed to save years before. As the black car rolled out of the harbor district and merged into the damp streets of the February morning, Crispin Vale drove in silence, but his mind was no longer in the present. It had drifted back many years, to the face Tobias's words had just awakened, the face of Brioni. Brioni was his sister, the little sister, 6 years younger than him, the one he had once carried on his back through all the poor alleys where the 2 of them had grown up, the sister whose smile was bright enough to soften even the darkest days. Brioni became a mother too young, and the man who had once made promises to her disappeared the moment he learned the news, leaving her alone with a newborn child, and a world that wasn't very forgiving to women in her circumstances. She worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs at once. She held herself together day after day, and every time Crispin came to visit, he saw his sister grow a little thinner, saw the shadows under her eyes deepen a little more, saw her smile fade a little more, but she always said, "I'm fine, Crispin. Don't worry about me. Take care of yourself." Back then, Crispin was still young, still struggling to carve out a place for himself in a harsh world, and he had believed her, or perhaps he had wanted to believe her, because believing she was fine was far easier than admitting that she was slowly sinking, and he was too busy to reach out and pull her back up. The last time he saw Bryony was on a rainy afternoon. She was sitting by the window of her small apartment with her sleeping child in her arms, and when he asked whether she was all right, for the first time in her life, she didn't say she was fine. She only leaned her head against the window frame, looked out at the rain, and whispered in a voice so faint he almost didn't hear it, that she was tired, so tired down to the bone. Crispin remembered placing his hand on her shoulder, remembered telling her to let him finish arranging a few things and then he would come back to take her and the child home with him, that everything would be all right, that she only had to hold on a few more days. He had promised, and then work swept him away. 1 day passed, then 2, then 3, and each day he told himself he would go tomorrow. Tomorrow for certain. She was fine. She had always been fine. When he finally returned on the 3rd day, it was already too late. Crispin never told anyone what happened inside that small apartment, and he didn't allow his mind to linger too long in that moment either, because the pain was too great, too sharp, and even now it could still cut into him as if it had happened only yesterday. What he remembered most clearly, what had haunted him for years, was the feeling that everything could have been different, that if he had come even 1 day earlier, if he had listened more closely to that sentence, "I'm so tired," instead of brushing it aside as a passing complaint, if he had understood that sometimes people cried for help, not with a scream, but with the softest whisper, then perhaps his sister would still be sitting there by the window, still smiling at him, and his little nephew would still have a mother. He hadn't arrived in time for 3 days, and those 3 days became the debt he carried through the rest of his life, a reminder that his power and money meant nothing if he couldn't protect the people he loved when they needed him most. Crispin stopped the car at an intersection when the light turned red, both hands tightening around the steering wheel, and he drew in a deep breath to push the memory back into the depths where he always kept it locked away. When the light turned green, he let the car move on toward Pratt Street, toward the damp pawn shop he intended to stop by and check the books, with no idea that fate was waiting for him there in the shape of a strange woman, and that in only a few minutes he would see on a stranger's wrist the exact mark he had been too late to save years before. When Maeve rushed out of the pawn shop into the rain, she only had time to clutch the silver watch tightly to her chest and run as fast as she could from the powerful man who had just made the whole room hold its breath, from Roland standing frozen in place, from everything. But her body was too exhausted to carry her far. She hadn't eaten anything since the night before, had worked herself ragged since before sunrise, had stood on trembling legs for too long, and after only a few blocks, the world around her began to sway, the buildings tilted, the sound of the rain drifted farther away, and Maeve sank down beneath the awning of a closed shop, her back against the cold brick wall, her breath broken and uneven. She didn't know how long she had been sitting there. She only knew that when she looked up through tears and rain, she saw a black car pull to the curb, and the man from the pawn shop stepped out, his charcoal overcoat darkened by water, his gray eyes looking straight at her. Maeve instinctively shrank back, pulling the watch closer against her chest, because bitter experience had taught her that a man walking toward her rarely brought anything good. But Crispin Vale didn't hurry closer. He stopped several steps away from her, and in a low voice lowered until it was almost gentle, he said she was about to collapse from hunger, that he wasn't going to do anything to her, that he only wanted to take her somewhere dry. Maeve shook her head, meaning to say she didn't need anyone's help, but her lips had gone so pale and were trembling so badly that no words came out, and when she tried to stand, she staggered and nearly fell. Crispin reached out to steady her, and the very instant his hand lifted, Maeve flinched and curled in on herself, her shoulders shrinking, her eyes squeezed shut as if waiting for something, a reflex that belonged only to people who had grown used to being hurt. Crispin stopped. He looked at that reaction, at the way her body automatically defended itself against a raised hand, and something inside his chest tightened, because he had seen that exact reflex before in someone else, had once seen his sister curl in on herself in just that way during the darkest years of her life. He slowly lowered his hand, stepped back half a pace so she wouldn't feel cornered, then said quietly that she could walk on her own, that he wouldn't touch her. Maeve opened her eyes and stared at him in astonishment. And perhaps it was that very restraint, the way he read her fear and stepped back instead of forcing his will on her, that made her trust him enough to nod and drag herself after him to the car. Inside the warm car, Maeve sat pressed into the corner of the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and Crispin drove in silence, asking nothing, demanding nothing, because he understood that there were people who had endured too many questions, so much so that silence became the kindest thing. But his eyes, trained to notice every detail, still quietly took in every trace on her. Her hands, thin and calloused, with the thickened skin of someone who worked without rest. The shoes on her feet, worn and frayed at the toes, one loose section of the sole tied in place with string. The thin coat that was nowhere near enough against the February cold. And then, when the car rolled over, a pothole in Maeve swayed slightly, reaching for the side of the seat to steady herself. Her sleeve slipped down a little more, revealing more clearly the dark purple bruises shaped like a hand around her wrist, the exact wounds he had glimpsed in the pawnshop, the exact wounds that had been burned into his memory many years before. Crispin gripped the steering wheel, his jaw hardening, and he had to force back the violent emotion rising in his chest, because he knew very well where those bruises came from, knew exactly what story they told, and knew that if he turned away and pretended not to see, he would once again become the same man who had arrived 3 days too late all those years ago. When the car stopped, he didn't say much. He only quietly took a stack of money from inside his coat and placed it on the seat beside her, saying she should take it to buy food and medicine, that this wasn't charity, only one person helping another. Maeve looked at the money, then looked at him, and in her tired eyes, beyond the astonishment, there was something Crispin hadn't expected, a glimmer of self-respect that poverty still hadn't managed to extinguish. Maeve looked at the stack of money lying on the seat for a long time, and in that moment, one part of her screamed to take it, to think of her daughter's nearly empty inhaler, to think of the 2 short days left, to think of the tin box with only $11 inside, because this money could solve everything, could buy medicine, buy food, pay down part of the debt hanging over her head. But another part of her, the part that had kept her standing upright through 14 months of storms, spoke louder, and that part wouldn't allow her to reach out. She didn't know who this man was, didn't know why a stranger with an expensive car and eyes as cold as steel had suddenly become so kind to her, and it was precisely that kindness without a reason that made her more wary than anything else. Life had taught Maeve a bitter lesson, that nothing was ever given for free, that whenever a man held money out to her, there was always a price to pay afterward, and she had paid enough, had lost too much, until the only thing left that she absolutely refused to sell was her own self-respect. She lifted her head, looked straight into Crispin's gray eyes, and though her whole body was still trembling from cold and hunger, her voice came out so clear and strong that even she was surprised by it, saying that she thanked him for driving her back, but she couldn't accept this money. Crispin started to say something, but Maeve had already pushed the stack of bills back toward him, and she went on in a choked voice that still didn't waver, saying that she didn't know who he was or what he wanted from her. But she wanted him to understand one thing, that she might be poor, she might be hungry, she might be dressed in rags, but she wouldn't sell her dignity, and she didn't owe him anything. Then she opened the car door, stepped down into the still drizzling rain, pulled her collar high, and disappeared into the gray street without looking back once, her thin figure walking through the rain with a fragile pride that all the misery in life still hadn't been able to break. Crispin remained seated in the car, the stack of money still lying on the seat where she had pushed it back, and he watched her until her shadow dissolved into the rain and the streets. In all his years ruling this harbor district, too many people had come to him to beg, to ask favors, to bargain, and he had grown used to seeing greed, fear, and servility appear in people's eyes whenever they faced him, so used to it that he had almost forgotten another thing still existed in this world. Yet that woman, someone standing at the edge of ruin, someone he could lift up or crush with a mere flick of his hand, had refused his money in order to keep hold of her dignity, and that made something inside him move, an emotion he hadn't felt in a very long time. True respect. But more than respect, what made Crispin unable to push that woman from his mind were the bruises on her wrist, the marks exactly like the ones his sister had once carried, and the way she had shrunk from a raised hand, that defensive reflex he had once seen in Brioni and had once closed his eyes to until it was too late. He took out his phone and called Tobias. And when the other end picked up, Crispin said in a low, decisive voice that there was a woman he needed to know about, a widow named Maeve Sullivan, who lived somewhere around Pratt Street, and that Tobias should quietly find out everything about her, who she was, what she had been through, and most importantly, who had left those wounds on her body. Tobias was silent for a moment on the other end, then asked why, and Crispin answered with only one sentence, a sentence that made the old uncle understand at once that his nephew had already decided that this time he wouldn't let himself arrive too late again. 2 days later, Tobias returned to the harbor office with a thin file and a heavy expression, because what he had found about the woman named Maeve Sullivan wasn't the story of an ordinary person who had fallen on hard times, but a chain of tragedies piled one upon another so heavily that he had to wonder how she was still standing. Crispin sat down, folded his hands on the desk, and listened in silence as his old uncle turned through each page. Tobias began with the heart of it, that Maeve hadn't always been as poor as she was now, that 14 months earlier she had once had a small home and a husband named Sean Sullivan, a skilled welder who worked for a large construction company in the city. Sean was a strong, hard-working man, and according to their former neighbors, he loved his wife and child, at least on the surface. But on a winter morning 14 months ago, at a high-rise construction site where he was working, part of the scaffolding suddenly collapsed, and Sean and 2 other workers never came home. Tobias paused a little before continuing with the part that angered him most, that the construction company, instead of accepting responsibility and compensating the victims' families, had hired an entire team of lawyers to turn the situation around, blaming the dead workers themselves for being careless and failing to follow safety rules, and in the end, washing their hands of it without paying Maeve even a single cent. That young woman, in one morning, had lost both her husband and her only financial support, left alone with a small child and a grief no one stepped forward to help carry. By this point, Crispin's jaw had already tightened, but he remained silent, because he could feel that the story had not yet ended there, and indeed, Tobias turned to the next page with an even heavier face. There was something else, the old uncle said. Something Maeve herself had probably only learned after her husband was dead. Sean Sullivan, behind the appearance of a model husband, had hidden a secret from his wife, that he was addicted to gambling, and during the years of losing, he had borrowed a very large amount of money from a loan shark group, operating under the cover of what sounded like a legitimate debt collection company. While Sean was alive, he carried that debt in silence, but when he suddenly died, the debt didn't die with him. It passed onto the shoulders of a widowed wife who had never known it existed. Tobias said that not long after her husband's funeral, those men came looking for Maeve, forcing her to pay a debt she hadn't even known was real, and when she couldn't manage it on her meager waitressing wages, they began pressing harder and harder, threatening phone calls in the middle of the night, blocking her path on the street, and even laying hands on her in ways that left wounds she had to hide. By then, every piece in Crispin's mind had fallen into place, and he understood the source of the hand-shaped bruises on that woman's wrist, understood why she shrank from a raised hand, understood why she was so afraid that she didn't dare trust anyone. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was only a woman trapped between the debt of a dead man and the cruelty of men who valued human life less than money, and she had fought all of it alone in silence to protect her little girl. Crispin stood, walked to the window overlooking the gray harbor, and inside his chest rose something that was both a cold fury and a sorrow he had thought he had buried long ago. He thought of Bryony, thought of women abandoned by the world at the very moment they most needed to be held up, and he knew that this time he couldn't turn away. But there was still one question hovering in his mind, a question even Tobias's file had not fully answered. He turned back to look at his old uncle and asked in a low, sharp voice, who was really pulling the strings behind that disguised debt collection group, who was running them and letting them run wild right inside the area where he should have known every corner. While Crispin was following the threads through the harbor district, a few blocks away, Maeve knew nothing at all about the quiet attention being turned toward her, and that night, when she returned to her rented room after a late shift, something made her heart seem to stop. Parked across the street, not far from the shoe repair shop, was a black SUV with dark-tinted windows, its engine still humming softly, and though she couldn't see who was sitting inside, Maeve still felt a chill run down her spine. She had lived in fear for too long not to recognize its signs, and the first thought that crashed through her mind was that they had found where she lived, that the debt collectors had finally tracked her all the way to her door, all the way to the place where her little girl was sleeping. Maeve didn't dare walk straight in. She went around to the back, pressed herself into the darkness of the alley, her heart pounding so hard she thought the whole neighborhood could hear it, and only when she was certain no one was following did she creep up the stairs to her room. She locked the door, wedged a chair under the handle, then stood tucked behind the thin curtain, holding her breath as she watched the car below, and only much later, when it still sat motionless without moving, did she dare step away from the window. But the fear remained, clinging to her all that night and refusing to let go. She sat beside her daughter's bed, watching Nora Beth sleep peacefully under the warm blanket, her soft hair spread across the pillow, and she wondered how much longer she could protect her before the cruel world outside found them and took everything away. What frightened Maeve wasn't only the debt collectors, but another deeper, more hidden terror, that if everything came out, if people learned about her situation, about the debt, about the threats, about the wounds on her body, they might decide she wasn't capable of raising her child, and they would take Nora Beth from her arms. That fear was what had forced her to hide everything, to tell no one, to ask no one for help, to carry alone burdens far too heavy for one human being, because she would rather endure anything than lose the only thing that still gave her life meaning. The next morning, when Maeve went down to the shared kitchen to make a little warm water for her daughter, Mrs., Agnes was already sitting there, and the old woman's failing eyes were still sharp enough to know something wasn't right. She gently asked whether Maeve had been all right lately, why she seemed so easily startled, and said that last night she had heard Maeve dragging a chair against the door. Maeve forced a smile and answered that she was just a little tired, that work had been too much lately, then hurriedly changed the subject before the old woman could ask anything deeper. Mrs. Agnes looked at her for a long time, her gaze filled with the understanding of someone who had nearly walked through all of life and had seen too much suffering. Then she only laid her wrinkled hand gently over Maeve's and said that if something was wrong, she shouldn't carry it alone, because she still had her here. Maeve nearly broke into tears, nearly poured everything out. But then she swallowed it all back down, pressed her lips tight, and only nodded her thanks, because she couldn't. She didn't dare drag this kind woman into the danger surrounding her. Back in her room, Maeve opened the drawer and took out her mother's silver watch, the thing she had almost lost at the pawn shop if that strange man hadn't stepped in, and she gripped it tightly in her palm, pressed it to her chest, feeling the cold of the metal sink into her skin like the last handhold in the storm of her life. She turned it over, looked at the Gaelic inscription her mother had once engraved there, the letters worn down by the years but still readable, and whispered to the mother who was gone, "Mom, I'm so tired. I don't know how much longer I can hold on, but I won't give up. For my child, I'll never give up." She had no idea that the black car parked on the street the night before had not brought the danger she feared, and that the truth behind it was about to turn her life in a direction she had never seen coming. For the next several days, that black car kept appearing, sometimes parked across the street, sometimes rolling quietly behind her for a short distance, before turning away, and Maeve's fear kept growing until one late afternoon, when she finished her shift and turned into a shortcut alley on her way home. She saw the man from that car standing with his back against the hood, talking on the phone. She pressed herself behind a wall, her heart hammering, and it was then that she caught a few scattered words, heard him mention her name, heard him reporting to someone on the other end that she had just left the diner, that the little girl was still at home with the old woman, that everything was still under control. Every drop of blood in Maeve's body seemed to freeze. Someone was watching her daughter too, recording every step the two of them took. And in her mind, already cracked by too much fear, only one conclusion appeared, that this had to be one of the debt collectors, that they had not only found where she lived but had sent someone to watch her and tighten the trap around her. And then an even more terrifying thought struck her, that the strange man at the pawn shop that day, the one with the elegant black car and eyes as cold as steel, the one the whole room had feared, might very well be another link in the network hunting her down, that his kindness had been nothing more than a carefully made trap to make her lower her guard. Maeve didn't dare think any further. She nearly ran home, and the decision had already formed in her mind the moment her foot touched the stairs, that she had to take her child away from here, tonight, before it was too late. In the small room, she quickly packed the most necessary things into a cloth bag, a few sets of clothes for Nora Beth, the inhaler, a little loose change, and her mother's silver watch, which she never left behind. She knelt beside the bed and gently woke her daughter. And when Nora Beth's sleepy eyes opened in confusion, Maeve smiled as tenderly as she could, stroked her hair, and whispered that the two of them were going on a little adventure, that she could close her eyes, lean against Mommy, and keep sleeping, and Mommy would keep her warm. She wrapped the child carefully in the thick blanket, put an extra coat on her, pulled a wool hat over her small head, then lifted her into her arms, pressing the little face against her shoulder so she wouldn't feel the cold and wouldn't sense the trembling in her mother's hands. Nora Beth trusted her completely. The little girl only nestled softly into her mother's neck, her warm, steady breath brushing Maeve's skin, and before long she had drifted back to sleep in the arms that, to her, were the safest place in the world, knowing nothing of the terror tearing through her mother's heart. Maeve left a hurried note for Mrs. Agnes, saying she had to go away for a few days because of something urgent, and asking her not to worry, then silently carried her daughter down the stairs and stepped into the night. She walked quickly through the empty streets, holding the child tightly against her, her eyes constantly glancing behind to see whether any black car was following, and there was only one goal in her mind. A small church not far away where the elderly pastor had once said the doors were always open to anyone who needed shelter in the night. The distance wasn't long, but for an exhausted woman carrying her child and the full weight of fear, it felt endless, and still Maeve kept walking without stopping, because to her, in that moment, nothing mattered more than bringing her daughter somewhere safe. When she finally managed to push open the heavy wooden door of the church and step into the warm candlelight, an older nun hurried forward to meet them, draped a blanket over mother and child, and led them to a soft pew in a sheltered corner away from the draft. Maeve sat down, still holding her sleeping daughter in her arms, and for the first time in many hours, she let her shoulders sag, silent tears rolling down her face, because she believed she had brought her child out of danger just in time, never knowing that she had misunderstood everything, and that the man she was running from was actually the only person trying to protect her. Crispin's men lost track of Maeve the very night she left, and when word reached him that the woman and her little girl had vanished from the rented room, a cold worry he hadn't felt in a long time suddenly tightened around his chest, because he understood that a terrified woman fleeing through the night with her child in her arms, in a city crowded with danger, was far more vulnerable than she would have been staying in a place where someone was quietly watching over her. He drove out to search for her himself, following every small lead, asking at the places a desperate person might go for shelter. And it wasn't until nearly dawn, through the words of a night vendor, that he learned a woman carrying a child had gone toward the old church at the end of the street. When Crispin found her, Maeve was sitting on a bench at the bus stop across from the church in the weak yellow light. Her daughter, still sleeping deeply, wrapped warm in her arms, while she waited for the earliest bus to take her farther away, anywhere at all as long as it meant escaping the people she believed were hunting her. The moment she saw his figure step out of the familiar black car, Maeve's whole body went rigid. She shot to her feet, clutching her child tightly against her, backing away step by step, and in a voice breaking from fear and exhaustion, she cried that he shouldn't come closer, that she knew his people were watching her. She knew everything, and he had to leave her and her daughter alone. Crispin stopped at once. He didn't take another step. He only stood still beneath the light and raised both hands so she could see he meant no harm. Then, in a low voice, slowed until it was almost soft, he said she had misunderstood, that the men in the black car hadn't come to hurt her. They were his men, sent by him to protect her and her daughter from the very people who were threatening her. Maeve shook her head, tears streaming down her face. She didn't believe him. She asked why. Why would a man like him care about a ragged stranger like her? What did he want from her? And that was the moment Crispin did something he hadn't done with anyone in all those years. He told her about Brioni. He told her about the little sister he had loved more than his own life. A single mother who had struggled alone in silence until she was worn down to nothing. He told her about the last time his sister had said she was so tired, and about the promise to come back that he had failed to keep, about the 3 days too late that had become a regret he carried through the rest of his life. He said that the day he saw the bruises on Maeve's wrist in the pawn shop, the day he saw her shrink away from a raised hand, he had seen his own sister again, and he knew that if he turned his back this time and pretended not to see, he would never be able to forgive himself once more. The powerful man's voice trembled slightly at the end, And in those gray eyes that had seemed made only of cold steel, Maeve saw real pain for the first time, a sincerity that couldn't be faked. She stood there in the empty bus stop with her daughter in her arms, torn between the suspicion that had sunk deep into her after so many months of betrayal and the fragile spark of trust that had just been lit by what she had heard. She looked down at Nora Beth's angelic face sleeping peacefully, then looked back at the man standing silently beneath the light, waiting, and finally, in a voice still uncertain, she asked what he would do if she believed him. Crispin answered that first, he would take her daughter somewhere truly safe, and that place wasn't with strangers. He had already had his people contact Mrs. Agnes, the woman Maeve trusted, and he would arrange for the old woman and the child to stay in a discreet house under his protection, where no debt collector could ever find them. Maeve went silent for a long while, then gave a small nod, and in that nod was both the surrender of someone far too exhausted and one final wager on the kindness of a stranger, because for the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to fight alone anymore. After Nora Beth had been taken to a safe place with Mrs. Agnes under the careful watch of Crispin's men, he returned to the question that had been hanging in his mind all this time, the question of who was truly pulling the strings behind the disguised debt collection group running wild right inside his territory. And this time, Tobias brought back an answer that made both men fall still. For days, Crispin's people had quietly followed the path of the money, watched secret meetings, and discovered that the loan shark group was not operating alone as it appeared on the surface, but had a legal middle link, helping them hide every trace. And that link was none other than Roland Dietrich, the diner owner Maeve worked for. Crispin sat listening to Tobias lay it out, his face growing colder with every passing moment, because each piece now appeared with brutal clarity. Roland wasn't merely a miserly man who liked exploiting desperate workers like Maeve. He was also an important link in the entire operation, using his shabby diner as a front to legitimize dirty money from gambling and loan sharking. The murky income and expenses in the diner's books, the large cash movements with no clear source, all of it was their way of washing clean the money earned from the blood and tears of people like Maeve. And worse still, Roland was the one who had quietly pushed Maeve toward the edge, cheating her out of her wages so she would grow even more desperate while playing the helpful guide who led her toward pawning her belongings. All of it part of a cold calculation, meant to tighten the vice and force her to repay the debt her husband had left behind. Crispin clenched his hand until his knuckles turned white. But what enraged him wasn't only Roland's cruelty toward a woman standing alone. It was also another truth Tobias pointed out. This group, the old uncle said, was a rising force, a pack that had emerged in the last few years and operated with extreme sophistication, slipping into the corners of the district beneath legal covers like debt collection companies and small businesses, and because they had hidden themselves so tightly, they had been able to run wild inside Crispin's territory for a long time without him knowing. To a man like Crispin, this was a double insult, because not only had they hurt the vulnerable people he believed should be protected, they had also brazenly trespassed, sowing brutality on the very ground he had worked so hard to preserve under his own rules. He stood, walked to the window overlooking the harbor at night, and a plan slowly began taking shape in his mind. But it wasn't the plan of an underworld man wanting to answer with violence. Crispin had lived too many years in that hidden world not to understand that blood only drew more blood, that if he acted in the old way, he would be no different from the men he wanted to remove, and more importantly, he didn't want to drag Maeve and her daughter into a spiral of hatred with no way out. He turned to Tobias and said that this time they would do it differently, that they would gather every piece of evidence, every ledger, every filthy transaction belonging to Roland and the network behind him, collect all of it into a file strong enough that they couldn't deny it, then place the whole thing into the hands of people in law enforcement whom he could trust. So the law itself would be what crushed them. Tobias looked at his nephew, and in the old uncle's eyes there was both surprise and a quiet pride, because he realized Crispin was choosing a path his father years ago might never have chosen. A harder path, but a nobler one too. Crispin said softly, almost to himself, that he was too tired of solving everything with fists and fear, that perhaps this was his chance to do something right, something Bryony would have been proud of if she were still alive. But for that legal trap to close at the right moment, he knew he needed one final link, one moment that would force Roland and his accomplices to show themselves in broad daylight. And that piece, though he didn't want to admit it yet, involved the very woman he was trying with all his strength to protect. When Crispin laid out his plan, he had originally intended to keep Maeve completely out of it. But it was she who, after hearing the whole truth about Roland and the network that had destroyed her life, offered to take part. She said she had been running and fearing for too long, that she didn't want to spend the rest of her life living in the dark and looking over her shoulder every second, and that if there was a chance to end all of it, she wanted to help do it herself, not as a helpless victim, but as someone brave enough to stand up and demand justice for herself. Crispin looked at her for a long time, and though everything in him resisted putting her at any risk, he also understood that this was something she needed to do in order to reclaim control over her own life. So at last he nodded, with only one condition, that she had to follow every step he arranged exactly, and that his people would always be within reach. The plan was clear. Maeve would return to Roland's diner at the end of the day, and openly demand the rest of the wages he had been stealing from her all this time. A perfectly reasonable and natural excuse, enough to make Roland believe she was still the same desperate prey she had always been. But that demand would also be the signal for him to call in the men from the network, because Crispin calculated that once Roland felt his prey was beginning to grow stubborn and demand what was hers, he would want to use the debt collectors to intimidate her and tighten his grip once more. And that would be the moment they had to show themselves. That night, beneath the sickly yellow lights of the nearly empty diner, Maeve walked in with a calm she hadn't expected to find inside herself, and she told Roland plainly that she had come to collect the money that belonged to her, every single dollar, and that she wouldn't leave until he paid her in full. At first, Roland froze at her strangely firm manner. Then he gave a mocking laugh and told her to come out back to talk so she wouldn't bother anyone, exactly as Crispin had predicted. In the parking lot behind the diner, where only one lonely streetlight cast its pale glow, Roland didn't come alone. With him were several heavy figures stepping out of a waiting car, men Maeve recognized at once as part of the debt collection network. The diner owner smiled in triumph and said she had chosen the wrong way to behave, that it was time to remind her who she owed and how much she owed, and the men began closing in around her in the dark parking lot. In that moment, with her heart pounding, Maeve still stood straight and didn't step back, because she knew she wasn't alone. And right then, two beams of headlights suddenly blazed from both sides of the lot, sweeping straight over the men surrounding her and forcing them to raise their hands to shield their eyes. And from within that circle of light, Crispin Vale stepped out, followed by Tobias and several of his men, his stride slow but full of power, his charcoal overcoat stirring softly in the night wind. The whole parking lot seemed to freeze. The men from the network, who were used to bullying the weak, suddenly went pale when they realized who had appeared, because the name Crispin Vale carried a weight in the harbor district that no one dared dismiss. Roland stammered, trying to ask why he was here, saying this had nothing to do with him. But Crispin only looked at him with gray eyes cold as ice, and said in that low, deliberate voice that everything that happened on this land had something to do with him, and that men who made a habit of spreading fear among people who couldn't defend themselves would sooner or later have to face someone who didn't fear them at all. The confrontation stretched tight as a drawn wire. The men glanced at one another, a few of them looking ready to move. But in an instant, Crispin's people had completely overpowered them with numbers, and with that absolute cold force, restraining them before anything could spin out of control. And the clash of metal and short-shouted orders rose briefly, before fading quickly into the night. When everything had settled and the men from the network had been forced into a corner with no path out, Crispin walked to Maeve's side, standing between her and those men like a wall, then quietly asked whether she was all right. Maeve, though her whole body was still trembling from the tension, felt something she hadn't had in a very long time, the feeling of being protected. And she lifted her eyes to look at that man, nodded softly, and understood that tonight, for the first time in all those months, the vice tightening around her life had finally been broken. The men from the network were crowded into one corner of the parking lot, and a few of them looked at Crispin as if waiting for the worst, because in the world they knew, a confrontation like this usually ended in only one way, and they had prepared themselves for it. But Crispin didn't do what they thought he would. He didn't swing his fists, didn't order punishment, didn't let the anger boiling inside him lead the way, because he had spent too many years in the dark, not to understand that answering brutality with brutality would only make him another version of the very men he despised. Instead, he signaled to Tobias, and the old uncle quietly took out a thick file, along with the audio and video devices his people had been gathering in secret for many days, all the evidence of the loan sharking operation, of the dirty money flowing through Roland's diner, of the threats, and even of the intimidation that had just unfolded tonight. Crispin spoke to those men in a low and decisive voice, saying that from this moment on, their fate was no longer in his hands, but in the hands of the law, and that what they had done to so many people would be dragged into the light in exactly the way they deserved. Only a few minutes later, police sirens sounded in the distance and drew closer, red and blue lights flooding the dark parking lot. And the people in law enforcement whom Crispin trusted arrived, taking the entire file along with the restrained men, including Roland Dietrich, who was trembling and stammering hopeless denials. Maeve stood there and watched it all, and as everything slowly settled, a question that had been tormenting her finally escaped. She looked at the man who had just saved her, looked at the way an entire force seemed to fear him, looked at the cold authority radiating from him, and she asked quietly, in a voice filled with both gratitude and confusion, who he was, whether he was also a man like them, whether he too lived in that world of violence and power. The question wasn't an accusation. It was the very real fear of someone who had been hurt too much to dare believe that kindness could exist without a price attached. Crispin was silent for a moment, and instead of denying it or defending himself, he looked straight into her eyes and told her a truth he had never fully told anyone. He admitted that yes, he had lived his whole life in the world she had just named, that his hands were not clean, and that there were many things in his past he wasn't proud of, but there was one line he had never crossed, and that was hurting people weaker than himself. Then his voice sank a little lower, and he said that his sister had once been like Maeve too, that she had once struggled alone and secretly hoped someone would appear and reach out a hand to her, that his sister had waited for someone like him to come and save her, and he had arrived 3 days too late. 3 days he would regret for the rest of his life. He said that was why he couldn't stand there and watch Maeve sink the way his sister had years ago, that helping her wasn't because he wanted anything from her, but because he didn't want to live once more with the feeling that he had come too late. Maeve stood frozen as she listened, and in that moment, the wall of suspicion she had built around herself through all those months began to crack, because she realized the man before her wasn't a predator, nor was he a perfect savior, but a human being carrying a wound much like her own, someone trying to make up for what he had failed to do in the past. And from that moment on, something between these two wounded people changed forever, a quiet understanding no words could fully describe, a point from which neither of them could ever return to what they had been before. The days after that night passed in a kind of peace Maeve had almost forgotten how to feel, because for the first time in 14 months, there were no threatening calls in the middle of the night, no shadows lurking behind her, no invisible vice tightening around her throat every day. Roland and the men from the network had been arrested, and with the mountain of evidence Crispin had handed over to the police, none of them could slip out of the reach of the law. Maeve brought Nora Beth home from the safe house where Mrs. Agnes had cared for her so carefully all that time. And when she held her daughter in her arms, healthy and rosy again, she cried, not from suffering as she had so many times before, but from a relief too great to contain. It was during those days that Crispin came to see her, and this time he brought an offer with him. He told her he had thought about it a great deal, that out there were still so many women living through circumstances just like the ones she had endured, single mothers, widows, people pushed to the edge with nowhere to lean, and he wanted to build a home for them, a safe shelter where they could stand back up and begin their lives again. He said he was ready to cover every cost, ready to arrange everything, and that he wanted Maeve herself to run the place, because no one could understand those people's pain better than someone who had walked through that same pain. It was an offer so generous that anyone in her position might have rushed to take it. A ready-made road out of poverty, a guarantee for both her future and her daughters. Maeve fell silent for a long time, and she was truly moved by his heart, because this time she no longer doubted Crispin's motives. She understood him now, trusted him now, knew that this offer came from a sincere heart trying to redeem what had haunted him from the past. But precisely because she understood and trusted him, she could say what she truly thought. She looked at him, and in a voice gentle but steady, so different from the trembling defensiveness she had once carried, she said she was deeply grateful to him, more grateful than words could ever express, but she couldn't accept. Crispin went slightly still, and she went on, saying that all her life she had lived under the decisions of other people, her fate shaped by her husband's death, by a debt she had never chosen to carry, by men who had treated her like a pawn, and now that she was finally free, She wanted her life from this point on to belong to her. She said that if she accepted everything from his hands, no matter how generous and sincere he was, she would still remain someone standing beneath his shadow, still someone who had been given something instead of someone who had claimed it for herself. And she didn't want her daughter to grow up seeing her mother as someone who always needed to be saved. She wanted Nora Beth to see a mother who could stand on her own 2 feet, even if those feet trembled, and even if the road was uneven. Crispin listened to those words, and instead of disappointment or the desire to persuade her, a flash of deep respect appeared in his gray eyes, because he realized that it was exactly that pride, that will to govern her own life, that made this woman different from anyone he had ever met. He gave a small nod, said he respected her decision, and that he would never force her to do anything she didn't want. But he also added, in a softer voice, that respecting her independence didn't mean he would stand by and do nothing, and that at the very least, he wanted to help her with one thing she had deserved for a long time, which was to seek justice for her husband's death. He quietly arranged for the best lawyer he knew to support her, not to act in her place, but to walk beside her into the legal battle she should have been helped through 14 months earlier. And this time, the person standing before the court to demand justice would be Maeve herself. The lawsuit wasn't easy, and Maeve understood that from the very first day she sat down with the lawyer in a room full of files and legal terms she had never heard before, but she was determined to see it through to the end, because this wasn't only a fight to reclaim the compensation the construction company had denied, but also a fight to reclaim honor for her late husband and for herself. The construction company that had once washed its hands of everything and blamed Sean and the dead workers still stood arrogant behind an entire team of expensive lawyers, still believing they could crush this poor woman the way they had before. But this time they were wrong. The lawyer Crispin arranged for didn't act in her place, didn't turn her into a puppet sitting silently while someone else fought for her. Instead, step by step, he guided her to understand her own rights, helped her gather each piece of evidence about the company's negligence in workplace safety, about the scaffolding that should have been inspected but never had been, about the statements of witnesses who had once worked with Sean and whom no one had bothered to listen to all this time. Most importantly, he helped her find her own voice again. Through the long court hearings, Maeve didn't hide behind anyone. She stood up before the court herself, and though her hands trembled and her voice sometimes caught in her throat, she still told her whole story. Told of the fateful morning when Sean left home and never came back. Told of the month she had spent alone holding her child in misery, while the people responsible calmly wiped their hands clean. She said she was standing there not only because of money, but because her husband and the workers who had died deserved to have their honor restored, because they were not careless men as the company had accused them of being, but honest working people who had lost their lives because of someone else's negligence. The sincere, weighty words of a mother, a wife who had walked through the deepest suffering, touched the hearts of those listening in a way that no cold legal argument from the other side could. Hearing by hearing, piece of evidence by piece of evidence, the scales of justice gradually tipped toward her, and the construction company's lawyers, who were used to using money and power to bend the truth, began to falter before a woman who had nothing but truth and courage. Finally, after weeks of tension that seemed endless, the verdict was delivered, and the court forced the construction company to accept full responsibility for the deaths of Sean and the other workers, and to compensate the victims' families in an amount worthy of the loss they had caused. When the judge struck the gavel and read the final ruling, Maeve sat motionless for a moment. Then tears spilled down her face, but these tears were different from all the tears she had shed throughout the past 14 months, because they were the tears of someone who had won justice by her own strength and resilience. She hadn't given up. She had stood up, and she had won. Along with that verdict, another door closed as well, because the evidence of the loan sharking network and money laundering operation that Crispin had handed over to the police had also brought Roland Dietrich and his accomplices before the law. The diner owner, who had once thought he could forever stand over desperate people to exploit and threaten them, now had to face serious charges and an undeniable sentence. And the small empire built on other people's pain, the one he had once been so proud of, collapsed completely. When Maeve heard that news, she felt no gloating satisfaction, only a quiet and relieving peace, because she knew that from now on, no one else would have to suffer under the hands of men like him. Stepping out of the courthouse on a rare sunny afternoon that month, Maeve held her head high, and for the first time in a very long while, she walked without having to look over her shoulder, without carrying fear with her, and she knew that her life, from this moment on, finally truly belonged to her. With the compensation she had won for herself in court, Maeve could have chosen an easier life. She could have found a small, warm house in a quiet neighborhood and lived peaceful days beside her daughter after so many storms. And no one would have blamed her if she had, because she had endured more than enough. But Maeve didn't do that. She still remembered with painful clarity what it felt like to be a woman standing in the middle of the world with no one reaching out a hand. She still remembered the nights when she held her child in her arms, curled up in fear, with nowhere to run. And she didn't want any other mother, any other woman, to suffer that same desperate loneliness. So she decided to use most of her money to turn the idea Crispin had once offered into reality, but in her own way, built and owned by her own hands. She rented a large old house in the neighborhood and worked with a few volunteers to repair each room, turning it into a safe shelter for widows and single mothers whom life had pushed to the edge, a place where they could find a roof, a warm meal, and most important of all, the feeling of being respected as human beings with dignity. And when she stood before the question of what to name that place, Maeve didn't hesitate. She named it Bryony House. It was a decision entirely her own, a quiet tribute she gave to Crispin's sister, a woman she had never met, the woman who had once struggled alone and had not had a home like this when she needed it most, the woman whose death had become the source of the compassion that saved Maeve's life. When she told Crispin about the name, the man who was always calm and cold had to turn his face away for a moment, and when he turned back, his gray eyes held something Maeve understood to be the deepest kind of gratitude, an emotion too powerful for him to put into words. Bryony House gradually began operating, and Mrs. Agnes, the kind old woman who had once shared even a bowl of oatmeal with Maeve in her hardest days, now became the soul of its kitchen, cooking hot meals every day for the women who came there, and her laughter, together with the warm smell of food, turned the place into a true home, not merely a shelter. Crispin remained there, but in the way Maeve wanted, quiet and unseen in the background, sometimes handling complicated legal procedures in silence, sometimes sending people to repair the leaking roof or broken water pipes, without ever accepting credit, never appearing to claim the spotlight, because he understood that this was Maeve's work, proof of her own strength, and he respected that more than anything. As for Nora Beth, the little girl who had once coughed through cold nights with an inhaler nearly empty, she was different now, with better living conditions, proper treatment, and a warm home no longer shadowed by fear. Her health improved clearly, the asthma attacks growing fewer and fewer until they almost disappeared. She ran through the halls of Bryony House, her soft hair flying in the sunlight, her bright laughter ringing out like a healing sound for all the wounded women living under that roof. She made friends with the other children who had come there with their mothers, invented games for them, and Mrs. Agnes often joked that the little girl was the youngest director of the house. Whenever Maeve watched her daughter playing, healthy and happy, watched women who had once been hopeless slowly find their smiles and hope again beneath the roof she had built with her own hands, she felt a simple but profound happiness, the happiness of someone who had turned her own pain into light for others, and she knew that her mother, if she were still alive, would have been so very proud of her. A year had passed since the day Bryony House opened its doors, and then another February afternoon arrived, with the familiar fine rain veiling the streets of Baltimore, exactly the kind of weather that had marked the day Maeve's life turned in a different direction. That day, on her way back from buying food for the shelter kitchen, she happened to pass the old pawnshop on Pratt Street, the very place where everything had begun, and through the fogged glass window, she caught sight of something that made her stop short, an image like a mirror, reflecting her own former self. A young woman, thin in a flimsy coat, was standing at the counter with trembling hands, slowly removing the wedding ring from her finger and placing it on the glass, her face wet with tears and heavy with the despair of someone forced to sell the last precious thing she owned in exchange for food and shelter. Maeve didn't hesitate. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, and as if guided by fate, she went to the young woman and gently placed a hand on her shoulder, just as a stranger had once stepped out of the darkness to save her long ago. She softly told the girl not to sell it, that there were things in this world that weren't meant to be bought and sold, but to be kept and passed on. The girl looked up at her with startled, guarded eyes, the very eyes Maeve herself had once carried. And Maeve smiled kindly, saying she understood better than anyone what it felt like to stand at the end of the road, that she had once stood in exactly this place, beside this very counter, and she knew a place that could help her, a place that would open its arms to her without asking her to trade away her dignity. She led the girl out of the pawn shop and toward Bryony House, and the circle of kindness closed once more only to open again, because what Maeve had once received had now become what she gave to someone else. Later, Maeve stepped inside the jewelry store, and this time, it wasn't to sell her precious keepsake, but to have it cleaned and polished. She proudly took out the first wages she had earned through her own work at the shelter, the first money in her life made with true dignity and independence. As the jeweler handed it back, Maeve held her mother's silver watch in her palm, cradling it as if cradling a part of her own life, and when she turned it over to look again at the familiar Gaelic words her mother had engraved, she suddenly discovered something that made her heart catch. Beside her mother's old inscription, there was now a new line, finely and deeply engraved, words that said, "Time cannot go back, but it can always begin again." Maeve stood motionless, and at once she understood who had quietly done this, who had silently left this tender message upon her most precious keepsake, to remind her that her storm had finally passed. She stepped out of the establishment, and through the soft curtain of rain, she saw, across the street, standing beside the familiar charcoal car, Crispin Vale. He didn't walk toward her, didn't say a word. He only looked at her in rare warmth, then gave a small nod, a nod that held everything words could not express, and then he turned away. And Maeve understood that between two people who had carried wounds so alike, something had quietly begun to bloom, not in haste, not loudly, but with equality and respect, two people standing firmly on their own feet before choosing to walk toward each other, and she knew that whatever the road ahead might become, her heart was finally ready to begin again. The story of Maeve Sullivan and Crispin Vale, in the end, isn't the story of a rich person rescuing a poor one, but a story about human dignity, about how even when life pushes us to the farthest edge of hardship, self-respect and kindness are still things that must never be bought or sold, and how sometimes, one small act of kindness at the right moment can relight an entire life that seemed to have gone dark. Kindness doesn't distinguish between rich and poor, and each of us, no matter what circumstances we are in, can become a light for someone sinking in darkness, because what we give today may very well return tomorrow to save us or someone else. If this story has touched your heart, please press the subscribe button for our channel, hit like, and share this video so we can spread meaningful messages together, and so you won't miss the new, compelling stories we bring you every day. We truly hope to hear your thoughts. So what do you think about Maeve's story? Which part moved you the most? Please leave a comment sharing the feelings from deep inside your heart so we can talk together. Thank you for taking the time to listen all the way to the very last moment. May you and your loved ones always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and love every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next videos.